We're delighted to have joining us the Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with responsibility for cyber and other emerging technology disruptive threats, climate, energy transition, and so forth. James Apathirai. We are, of course, gathered here today at the University of Sydney in the land of the Eora Nation and the Gadigal people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We'll hear from James. I'll have a bit of a dialogue with him, and then we'll open it up to your questions. James was appointed the Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO for Innovation and Cyber in 2021. He had previous jobs at NATO as the DASG, the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security. He was the spokesperson for NATO, and before that, he served in the Canadian Defense Department. James is going to talk about issues he's working on. He's here, by the way, for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI's Sydney dialogue, which focuses on technology and disruptive emerging challenges to all of our security. It was a very good conference. James gave an excellent presentation. I'm going to draw on some of the things he said today. But let me invite James to the podium to give you some if you
yeah, great. Yeah. Podium's good.
It'll bring you back to your NATO press spokesman days. And then I'll ask you to join me over here, and I'll quiz you a bit, and we'll open up the audience. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker.
So it's really great for me and my colleague Lelda to be here with you. My first visit, also her first visit to Australia, and we wanted to come, and I wanted to come because the relationship between NATO and Australia is deepening, and we had a summit a few weeks ago now in Washington, I guess a couple of months, and we took decisions there to deepen cooperation with Australia and other partners in the Indo-Pacific. But what I thought after our discussion earlier today was maybe just to give 5 minutes about how we are seeing things in NATO headquarters, in Euro-Atlantic security, and how things are changing for us. And then maybe we can chat a little bit, and then it'd be great to actually hear from you. And it's really a pleasure to see all of you this late on a weeknight. So basically, I've been at NATO a really long time, 25 plus years. Apparently, when we moved from the old headquarters to the new headquarters, the assistants had to list, what has to move over, paintings and furniture, and there's a list of artifacts, and one of them thought it would be funny to put me in the artifact list. So that tells you how long I've been around. But I have been around for the evolution. And when I was there, and then when I was spokesman, we were very heavily engaged in Afghanistan. And I had the opportunity to see and visit Australian troops in Oeruzgan who were there with the Dutch. We've had all kinds of cooperation in many areas over many years, including on cyber, which is why we're so happy that Australia is hosting the Cyber Champions Summit, which is taking place tomorrow, and we'll be attending that as well, co-hosting it with us. But the point I was trying to get to is that we've gone through a big evolution where NATO was founded in 1949 basically because of the concerns of the member states about Russian imperialism and expansionism. And that was very much the case during the Cold War. Cold War ended, we got engaged in Afghanistan and out-of-area operations. But the DNA of NATO has always been about collective defense, about ensuring the stability and security of its member states, but also because we really believe that the security of the Euro-Atlantic area is an important pillar for global stability for a whole range of reasons, which we can discuss. In 2014, because people talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and that was a decisive moment. But actually for us, the mind change started in 2014 when Russia took Crimea. And I think it's important to remember because sometimes people use the argument about NATO encirclement or that Ukraine wanted to join NATO, and this is why the Russians had to do what they had to do. But in fact, if you look back in 2014, Ukraine was constitutionally neutral. It was a neutral country. It had no aspiration to join NATO and could not. And the Kremlin took Crimea anyway. So NATO didn't do anything at that point with regard to supporting Ukraine. And some of us regret that, but it's the way it was. But we did begin to retool and start building up our collective defense, building up the plans, building up the forces in case that this was a preface. And I happened to be in Munich. There's a annual conference in Munich that is where the security people all come. And I was listening, you kind of half listen, you go to conferences like you're doing right now. And but Vladimir Putin started to speak, and I'd heard him speak many times. I'd been in the Kremlin a few times with the Secretary General. And then when I heard that speech, everyone lifted their head, because this is where, and I commend you to go and look at it because you can find it on YouTube, where he laid out what the real Russian ambitions were. 2007. And when I was in university studying political science, I was taught that Russia is like a riddle wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a puzzle. But actually my experience is that it's not at all like that. They say exactly what they intend to do. They say it repeatedly. They put it into law. They exercise it. And then they do it, and we're surprised. And they say, yeah, but we told you 20 times. And the Russian ambition to reimpose itself on its neighbors has been explicitly, repeatedly, constantly reiterated, and they've acted on it. So the sort of core business of NATO has returned, and we are ensuring the collective defense of our member states. We're trying to help Ukraine defend itself, because the idea of a nuclear-powered Security Council permanent member invading its neighbors and succeeding has profound implications everywhere in the world, including not just for our security, but in this region and elsewhere. But, and this comes more to my portfolio because I wanted to go, it's also the case that, so when I joined the division that we're in 3 years ago, it was called Emerging Security Challenges. And I changed the name of the division because they all emerged. And they have emerged. So, you mentioned some of the issues. What we see and what we try to work on in my area is what someone described a couple of days ago as everything but boom. And what we see is, for example, a sustained, concerted cyber conflict. It's on all the time. We heard today from at the conference from a Taiwanese colleague who said they get cyber attacked every second of every day. And that's pretty much, if you add up what's going on in the alliance, the same for us. And I would say there are a few areas where it's most concerning. One is a lot of attacks on critical infrastructure, often covered as ransomware. A lot of it coming from China as well. So you've heard maybe of something called Volt Typhoon. The Americans have warned about this, but the Russians do it too. And it can have very profound manifestations. You might have seen, for example, in the UK, where a whole host of hospitals were cyber attacked and were not functioning. That can apply to your water systems, to ports and airfields, et cetera. So a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of disinformation. And one of the things that concerns us in NATO is the new strategic partnership between the Russians and the Chinese. And that has implications two ways. In our region, where China is exercising on our borders, for example, with Russia and Belarus up in the Arctic, it is providing all kinds of components to the Russians to carry out their operations against Ukraine. It is amplifying Russian disinformation about Ukraine, about NATO, about the West, backing them up in political bodies. I think if I were here, I would be concerned that this can go the other way. So if China had tensions with its neighbors, there's Russia. And China has a ranking of political partnerships. And at the very top level, there's only one country, and that's Russia. So it's not just the two leaders like each other. They have a structural partnership in almost all sectors. So a lot of disinformation, a lot of political interference. Australia has, of course, experienced that from China. We get it very profoundly from the Russians, reaching into our political structures in many ways. We also get things like attacks against critical undersea infrastructure. So pipelines carrying oil and gas, data cables. And for us, this is a really, I know it's probably important here too, but just to give you a number, when it comes to data cables, every day, $10 trillion of economic activity go through undersea cables. And 4 trillion of that is across the Atlantic. There's basically one cable. So it's, something we need to worry about, and we've had things cut and blown up. So we work on that as well. There are other issues, a little less threatening, energy transition, which we can talk about. But it is a very different security environment than it used to be. We are, and then I'll stop with this, and then we can start talking together. I think one of the most profound changes is that our security now depends very much on private companies. Private companies run our information networks. They run our energy infrastructure. They run our ports and airfields and railways, which was not the case 60 years ago, but also a lot of the innovation, that's the first word in our division's name, new technologies that used to be promoted by, supported by the military. Like basically every technology in your phone, from the screen to the GPS to the GPRS to the chips, the memory chips, the satellites on which everything runs. This is all stimulated by military development. But now most of the innovation comes from the civilian world. And what we see in Ukraine is that the Ukrainians are depending on commercially available technologies, renting satellite information, using apps to defend themselves. And it's decisive for them. We can also see that China, for example, is highly competitive when it comes to crucial foundational technologies like artificial intelligence, like quantum, like biotechnologies. So we are at NATO and in our division investing in startups, investing in deep tech, trying to help small companies grow and make available to all of us these technologies so that we don't get left behind either on the battlefield or economically and in the security context. So we have a lot going on. We don't do the heavy metal, but we do the techno. And that's a little bit why we're here to talk to Australia, the Australian government, and to talk cyber tomorrow, and to talk with you today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks. Before we get into the discussion, let me also say we're honored to have the ambassador of Croatia here. Croatia is the contact group for NATO with Australia. Have I got that right? I hope Australia is keeping you busy. We have a special Croatia connection at the U.S. Study Center because our scholar professor, Gorana Grkic, is Croatian and is, I think, probably Australia's leading expert on NATO, except she's in Switzerland right now. So she asked me to fill in and pretend I'm a NATO expert, not an Asia expert. A lot of things I'd like to get into before we go to the audience: disinformation, the IP4 and the NATO connection with U.S. allies in this region, what we've learned about cyber and hybrid warfare in Ukraine as the wars unfolded, disinformation and so forth. Let me start with the NATO Australia or NATO IndoPac connection. I was actually in Washington during the summit for something else, but the four big U.S. allies in Asia, Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, sent leaders. Richard Marles went for Australia, not Prime Minister Albanese, which was too bad because I'm told when the four leaders walked into the NATO summit, they basically got a standing ovation. There was a real sort of excitement. In my own career in government, Europe, American policy, transatlantic and transpacific was so separate. Was so separate. Despite our efforts, it was very hard to get NATO to focus on this part of the world. It was very hard to get, Australia was always focused on Europe, frankly, but it's hard to get Japan, Korea. That has changed so much. But maybe you could say a bit more about why the IP4, why Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, U.S. allies in this region, why they are now cool in NATO. What is it that NATO sees that benefits the security of a member organization that is Euro-Atlantic?
Yeah, they are cool. That's true. And it's a great question. And I had something to do with the transition. because when I was in the earlier job, political affairs and security policy, you're absolutely right that until a few years ago, you would see a line about China, in our documents or whatever, but we didn't look to Asia Pacific. And I think it's changed in quite fundamental ways. One thing that has not changed, though, and I think it's really important to stress it, NATO is not coming militarily to this region. We have no intention of that. I would add, we don't think China is going to attack us, and we don't think China thinks we're going to attack them, because we're not. So it's not at all the same kind of context as we have with our immediate large neighbor, Russia. But there are a couple of reasons why this relationship has changed. One is what I already talked about, the China-Russia strategic partnership. We didn't come to Indo-Pacific, but China has come to us. And all of the ways in which China is supporting Russia in its war on Ukraine is profoundly important for our security. This is a war on our continent, on our borders, and it is being enabled politically, economically, and militarily, not with bombs, but with a lot of components and materials by China. That affects us, and we communicate that very clearly to the Chinese and our displeasure about it. So China has, in essence, made this linkage between our security and security here. So that's the first thing. Second is that, and I think everybody here knows that, you can see the autocracies circling their wagons and holding hands. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea is the most obvious and the most talked about. But it is also the case that China is exporting surveillance technology to autocracies all over the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in this region. And these countries are working ever more closely together. It is important that we, as democracies that believe in the rules-based international order, also, because of the situation we're facing, work more closely together. And that means politically, it means economically, and it means militarily. And we're pleased that that's happening. And I think the third reason is a bit more sort of practical, and that is flowing from this political cooperation. We need to recognize that our kind of supply chains, to use that word, have been exposed as very vulnerable. When it comes to, we all saw COVID, we saw that ship stuck in the Panama Canal, but we also see China cutting off essential supplies, including critical minerals and rare earths. So, we all need to work together. My country, I'm Canadian, has a lot of them, so does Australia, and we need to think together about how to ensure that we do not create new strategic dependencies on unreliable suppliers as we go through an energy transition away from dependence on Russia, in our case. So there's a lot for us to do together, and we face very common threats. You had a very good list. So there's lots of reasons why we're working together, but not that NATO is coming here with, troops. That's not going to happen.
The view of the prevailing view, as you know, in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, and in New Zealand, is that Vladimir Putin is engaged in an unjust and brutal war. The Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio said what other Asian leaders, including the president of Korea, said: Ukraine today could be Asia tomorrow. And they see a very clear risk to their security of Vladimir Putin succeeding. Not just the demonstration effect of a brutal land war to change borders, which this region is ripe with possibilities. It's not just that. It's a recognition, I think, that if Vladimir Putin succeeded, NATO's border with a nuclear-armed Russia would be significantly larger, and the drain on US forces and resources, in other words, away from this region, would also be enormous. So I think it's well understood. We do public opinion polling in Australia and Japan, well understood. But in some parts of this region, in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, what some would call the global South, the prevailing narrative is that NATO did start this. And we even heard this from one speaker from ASEAN at the conference. That, I think, in part reflects a sort of predisposition in post-colonial states, but it probably also reflects a pretty effective disinformation campaign by Russia and perhaps by China. Could you say a bit about the disinformation campaign that you see around the war in Ukraine? And to what extent do you think Russian and Chinese efforts are aligned?
So to answer that last bit, they are clearly aligned. We map the alignment. The messages are the same and complementary. There is a clear coordination of communication or miscommunication. And what is very new for us is that China communicates on NATO and on Ukraine. I mean, this is a long way away from China. It is not their business. It doesn't affect their security. And they never had negative comments to make about NATO because we've never done anything to them. But suddenly it all changed. And I think the fundamental reason, and it's not NATO policy, I'm just giving you my view, because I know this is being recorded. But you know, people talk sometimes about how, oh, well, they have differences. They have differences over Central Asia. They have differences over this and that. But what supersedes all of it is they both have one thing they want, which is to get the United States out of their neighborhood so they can do what they want to their neighbors. And that is so powerful that they're willing to cooperate on a whole host of issues where, frankly, you know, China can see that if the US is locked down here, locked down in Europe, not pivoting as much to Asia, well, that's not necessarily bad for Chinese political ambitions. No. So I think that's kind of the logic. You're absolutely right about the information campaign. And my friend Welda has heard me say this now 10,000 times, but I grew up in a house with a Sri Lankan father who was a Sri Lankan diplomat and was educated in Russia, went to MGIMO like many of them did. And my uncle was a diplomat, my aunt was a diplomat. So I grew up in a non-aligned movement culture, so I kind of understand it. So me going to work at NATO was the sort of ultimate scandal. It's like porn would have been better than this decision. But I do get it. I think that, of course, there's a post-colonial mindset, which makes for profound suspicion about the United States. They have been raised with generations of information about NATO that it's basically, you know, it's a pawn of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, I think we really need to push back on it. And I have done that, including with the ASEAN woman, but also with the very senior Indian diplomat last week and publicly, because it is hypocritical. I'm sorry. These countries all talk about international law, they talk about sovereignty, they talk about the rules-based order, but are willing to turn a blind eye to a brazen land grab with remarkable brutality, children being exported into Russia, mass graves. That's apparently okay in the context of suspicion about the United States. So I really think it's important that we don't just accept that people have different points of view. It's not acceptable to me. But how do we counter it? We're not good at it. No. We're not good at it. We're not heard properly. I think we have maybe not the right messaging, maybe not sufficient messaging. Also, volume has a lot to do with the success of communications, and sort of one debunking isn't going to do it. We do need to try harder, but I think we're really swimming upstream a little bit. The Russians and the Chinese are very effective and have been at it for years. And as you say, the groundwork has been laid for generations.
It isn't universal. You know, as you know, Singapore, for example, looks at Ukraine with real alarm because security of borders matters to them for obvious reasons. I think the Philippines' view is very different from, say, Malaysia, because they are a victim of gray zone, quite aggressive coercion themselves. So it isn't universal, but we are not great at it. We, the alliances. I mentioned to you the other day, I was at a US discussion about this, and the Pentagon spokesman said, well, we clearly have to get better at cognitive warfare with China and Russia in this information space. And then the State Department spokesman said, we need better public diplomacy. And, you know, we don't even know how to talk about it within the US, let alone with allies. And we're open societies. The other thing I think that probably hurts us, although we can't change this, is Chinese diplomats will go in and démarche media organizations that criticize Chinese policy. Mm-hmm. Our diplomats, and when I say ours, I mean European, American, we're used to criticism. It's our
No.
It's our normal thing.
And we couldn't do it. But I think one thing, just to quickly interject, sorry, but I mean, I commend anyone to go and look. You talked about cognitive warfare, and I think that that's an important point to understand how Russia's strategic culture is about cognitive warfare.
It's a Russian term.
Right.
Cognitive warfare.
And it includes military movement. Whereas we do what we're going to do, and then we communicate it. But Russia's strategic culture, and therefore the way in which they carry out all instruments of state power, is to achieve a cognitive effect. So I'll give you an example, which is at the hardest end, which is nuclear employment. So for us, NATO doctrine, Western doctrine, is that is the absolute last resort. And you do everything to avoid getting there. You do not threaten it. And there is every possible off-ramp in the way that NATO plans to get away from getting to that point. Russia threatens nuclear employment very early in the escalation scale. They did it over Ukraine. They repeatedly do it. You can, Google this. And the point is to freeze us in place. And now they're threatening to change their nuclear doctrine. They're saying it publicly. You don't normally talk about changing those things publicly in the West, but they do there. And the whole point is to achieve a cognitive effect. And they'll employ military force to achieve a cognitive effect, to make you stop. So it is a very different way of looking at things. You're absolutely right.
I want to talk about the so-called gray zone or hybrid warfare or everything but boom, everything left of boom issue. But first, on the disinformation campaign, are you finding that the emergence of AI and new information technologies is making it harder for the alliances, or potentially easier? How does that affecting the race?
There's a huge amount of discussion, and if anyone had the opportunity to follow the Sydney dialogue, usually, when I talk about nuclear stuff, that's the scary bit, but the AI panels were, they're all talking about the end of civilization in 3 years. So we don't say that.
10% of AI emerging frontier AI companies execs think that eventually the machines will kill us all. Just to cheer you up for the rest of the evening.
Yeah. 10% of them thinks there's a 50% chance of AI killing us all within the next 25 years. No, it's worse because you wouldn't get on a plane where 10% of the engineers thought that there was a 50% chance it was going to fall out of the sky, but they built the plane and put us all in it and sent it out, and we're on it now. So that's the way that is. But I think there's two areas in particular. I mean, there's a number of areas, but where AI is relevant, there's the whole military side. We can talk about that. But in the information space, I think there's probably two main areas of concern. And NATO is always about the concern, but potentially opportunity. One is cyber, and one is deepfakes, basically. Cyber is relevant because generative AI, ChatGPT, that kind of technology, it allows anyone to write code. So you now have democratized, like I can't write code, but now I can. So if you want to try to conduct a cyber attack, it's a lot easier to do. I mean, many more, not one person, now it's 1,000 people can do it. So that's a problem. Second issue that's a little bit of a problem is most successful cyber attacks, like 85% of them, are what people call phishing. It's basically tricking you, a human, to making a mistake rather than cracking through the code. And with AI being able to reproduce your voice perfectly and your face in video perfectly, it's going to be a lot easier to fool people into clicking on the wrong thing. So that is, I think, something of real concern. On the other hand, sticking with cyber for a moment, what we hear from cyber experts is generative AI can also run constant defense of your networks in a way, and look for patterns, look for anomalies of attack in a way that a human being, you'd have to hire bazillions of them to do it. This thing can do it all the time and across all your networks all the time. So there's a potential that AI can actually improve our cyber defenses because they can give an advantage to the defender, or at least even the scales a little bit. So that's not bad. Then, of course, there's the whole deepfake issue. And it is, I think, of real concern. So we brought in a number of companies who make this stuff. You'd know their names. And they we had 5 companies come in at quite high level. They agreed on 2 things. One was that by next year, 70% of everything that goes into the internet will be produced by artificial intelligence. And second, that within 4 years, 90% of what's on the internet will be fake, will be false. So you will not be able to trust anymore. You can already see it coming. Anything you see online. So that will have, I think, profound implications for confidence in truth, but also for politicians. Like, how will they communicate effectively to people in a way that people can trust? So for our democratic systems, I think that there are some real profound implications. I can't see the good ones in this case. I think there's a lot of risk.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, not cyber, but information, I'm struggling to see what's going to be better.
And part of the Russian campaign going back to the Soviet era, because the concepts are not new in Moscow, the technologies are. Mm-hmm. But now also for China, it seems pretty clear, particularly for democracies, like Taiwan. The goal is, we often think the goal is to tip an election this way or that way. Mm-hmm. The basic goal is to undermine confidence in democracy. That's what the Taiwanese speaker said at this conference. I've heard people in Taipei say this as well. The cyber attacks and disinformation they experienced in their elections were not ultimately aimed, if they could get a candidate they like better than Tsai Ing-wen or the current president, Lai Ching-te, that's a bonus. But the real goal was to undermine confidence in democracy. It's a systemic structural attack on open societies is the goal, in which case they just keep at it. It's not any particular election, it's constant.
No, that's true. And I think there's another goal, which is to undermine belief in truth. Right. There's a famous book by a guy named Peter Pomorantsev, who worked with and then on the Russian troll farms, and has now, published a lot. He's brilliant. And the title of his book is "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." And this was a Soviet expression to make it so that the population couldn't trust anything anymore. And that's already happening. You can see with younger people. My nephew, he doesn't believe anymore that there's truth and falsehood. It's opinion. Everybody's got a view. The New York Times thinks this, the Toronto Star thinks that, but there isn't fact. And so you can already feel it coming. I can feel it coming with young people. So that is one goal of this campaign as well. So that's worrying. But the Taiwanese are a really interesting example, and I commend folks to look at what they have done, including their Minister for Digital or Information, Audrey Tang, has been, I think, at the forefront of all of this. And they have basically democratized truth, meaning everybody fact checks everything. They have a particular way of putting out information. They put it out on multiple platforms, and they invite the public to comment so that people basically kind of Wikipedia fact all the time. And they do that in an intensive way around elections. And as a result, they have reinforced their democratic system by not making it that politicians just tell you more. They say, no, we want everybody to comment now. And then you go check. So it's working quite well. And I think that they have an example that we should be looking at as well.
They have a real challenge when Putin's forces invaded Ukraine. I am told 90% of social media commentary in Taiwan said, because NATO and because the US didn't send troops into Ukraine, that shows that if China attacks Taiwan, the US and US allies will never help Taiwan. 90% of the social media. And it was you know where it came from. Let's talk a little bit about what's the term of art for NATO now? Is it gray zone? Is it hybrid warfare? Is it?
Well, my division's called hybrid, so we'll say hybrid.
Go with little green man.
Many member states use gray zone as well.
Yeah, which I think was originally a Japanese phrase. So the gray zone basically is, we see it in the South China Sea against the Philippines right now. You see it against the Baltic states. It's the combination of cyber, of using military doctrine to, but it's basically trying to, Chinese say cabbage peeling, salami slicing, create new facts on the ground vis-a-vis an adversary by demonstrating that resistance is futile, short of war, which involves demonstrating, I think, a sense, whether it's Moscow or Beijing or North Korea or Iran, that they are willing to take a higher level of risk, that our allies, our societies have a lower risk tolerance. So it's very complicated. But you said something in the conference that I thought was interesting, which is there's a bit of artificiality to this line between kinetic, non-kinetic, gray zone, and war. Then in effect, if you're Taiwan right now or Latvia, you're under attack all the time in cyberspace. Could you elaborate on that? And what does that mean for NATO's concept of collective security? Just to put you in your former press spokesman spot.
Yeah. So I might start with a little distinction actually between the way Russia does it and the way China does, at least some of what you're talking about. A lot of what China is doing is quite overt. It's just not heavy military. It's, you know, the fishing fleets and the artificial island, but you know who's doing it. In the end, we kind of know that Russia's behind it, but Russia's not, in our region anyway, doing that kind of activity. What they are doing is cyber attacks, political interference, disinformation. They're pushing migrants across the border. Then we do know it's them cutting cables, but trying to do it in a way which is hard to actually attribute with the aim of, or the aims of creating disquiet, undermining support for Ukraine, and creating questions about our political system, etc. And we have successfully avoided that NATO is a party to the conflict in Ukraine. And that's the intent of the governments. We want to help Ukraine fight it for itself, and they intend to do it, but not get ourselves militarily involved. And Russia also doesn't want us to get militarily involved. So that's at least one thing. But the hybrid attacks are going up against us. And what is new is sabotage. We're getting a lot more sabotage. They're starting to become more bold. Their risk tolerance is higher. And by sabotage, I mean fires in bus stations, derailment of railroads, attacks against politicians, property, some assassinations against Russians who are exiled. And they do it by employing criminal gangs, for example, or hiring dupes to do it. But it is definitely on the upswing. And I think there's 2 points that you hit on that I want to note. One is it's a very risky strategy because you can push to a point where it becomes something else. And NATO has a agreement that hybrid attacks, so these kinds of attacks, can reach a threshold where the allies can decide to invoke the collective defense commitment. So it doesn't just have to be a bomb. And the way in which Article 5 is drafted is it's deliberately ambiguous. You don't know, and we don't know where that threshold is. It's a political decision. And I'll give you an example, which is a terrorism example. If we had tried to define what the line was before September 11th, it would have never included people hijacking a plane and flying it into a building. But we invoked Article 5 for the first time as a result of that decision, so of that action. So first thing I note is we don't know where the line is, but even we don't know where the line is. So there's risk of pushing too far. The second point I would make is, it's what you just said. It's not only left of boom, it's also after boom. The Ukrainians are getting the fire hose of everything all the time. So it's part of a continuum, which can include military activity at any point.
So let's talk about cyber and what NATO has learned and what lessons there are for Australia in Russian employment of cyber operations, beginning at the very beginning with the attack on the Viasat satellite. How have you seen, as you know, the famous Eisenhower line, any plan's good till first contact with the enemy, and then both sides start to innovate and learn. How has the use of cyber evolved over the course of the Ukraine war, and what are the lessons for NATO? What are the lessons for Australia or Japan or this part of the world?
That was great practice for my speech tomorrow morning.
Okay.
So thanks for that. I'd say the first thing is I wouldn't set the starting point at 2022. I'd set it at 2014. Because after that, the Ukrainians got serious about cyber defense. They understood that this wasn't the end of it, and they sustained a whole host of cyber attacks, constantly rolling. And then Viasat, you're quite right. So what the Russians did just as the war started was launch what they call a wiper attack against this company, Viasat, which not only crippled Ukrainian services, but rolled out to tens of thousands of computers outside of Ukraine in our countries and basically destroyed them. They were scrap after that. They've gotten better at targeting it. So what did the Ukrainians do? In the run-up to the war, in the years running up to the war, they did a few things, which was to have a lot of national capacity, so experts who knew how to fight, who had prepared to do the hands-on keyboards fight. They also made sure that their critical infrastructure could be run off-grid. And that's one thing we don't do very well, meaning we've connected everything to the internet and we rely on it, but that makes it vulnerable. They knew how to air-gap things that they needed to air-gap. When the war started, they did things that we need to do. One is they moved, and I have to commend here in particular Microsoft, they moved the critical data from their servers in Ukraine into the cloud. And that means they were not subject to kinetic attack. I mean, they were subject to it, but the data was all safe and essential government services could continue to run. The cloud is really, really important for securing your data. You know, when I started even 3 years ago in this job, I thought the safest place for my data was in my, computer under my desk. It's the worst place for it to be. And we have, secure cloud, as Australia does, I'm sure, as well. Second is to recognize that the IT companies are crucial. They run the networks. They know when the threat is coming. They're going to repair the networks. So you need a structural relationship with them, not an ad hoc relationship with them. Third is to unify the disaggregated elements, meaning your military needs to know what's going on civilian networks and vice versa. The companies need to be brought into this. The intelligence services need to be brought into this. So they have worked to bring all of that together, and you have to have legislation to allow for that. And then another area is that you need to bring in international partners. The US is, of course, the most capable, but many, many NATO countries, including my own, have helped to defend Ukrainian networks and provide support to them. So these are like 5 basic steps. But in the end, there's a huge amount. I think that's the most important point. You can't wait till the crisis to do all of this. You have to do all of the basics, have the right people in place, the right legislation in place, and the best equipment that you can afford. Just to tell you a final story, but Iran, so the Albanian government was attacked by an outside actor, which they attributed to it being Iran, and it was pretty clear it was Iran because it happened twice and for a very clear political reason. So we went there afterwards to try to help them out. And, Albania is not the most wealthy country in NATO. It didn't have the most advanced computers. It had software that was old. They hadn't updated their licenses for their software. They didn't have as many trained experts as most other NATO countries would have to defend their networks. They were super vulnerable. And the impact of it was, amongst other things, their border controls were taken out. It's not a small thing. And all of their interior ministry files were dumped onto the dark web. Every police investigation, every secret witness, every email between police officers, every Interpol file was on the news. And people were getting killed all over the country. It was chaos. So doing your groundwork will have profound implications for your security once or if tensions get bad. So don't wait for the crisis.
Let me ask one more question before we go to the audience. Let's say you come back here in a year. I hope you do. What does good look like in your part of NATO in terms of Australia's relationship with the treaty organization? What would you be working on in a year? Obviously, it's not the Australian Expeditionary Force going to the NATO front line in the Baltics, or a NATO Joint Naval Task Force in the Taiwan Strait. It's not metal. But what does good look like in a year in terms of Australia's relationship with NATO?
So I want to say first, it is a great relationship already of real confidence. Second, of experience working together, as I mentioned, in the field. So the foundations are very, very strong. We're like-minded countries, but also we have experience together. Where we see areas for possible future deepening of the cooperation includes on hybrid, and I think in particular, as you mentioned, disinformation. That's an area where we'd like to do more. We'd like to do more when it comes to cyber defense. I think we would also like to do more, just to mention one, where to support Ukraine. Australia is already doing a lot. We'd like to do more. Ukraine's fate is not just for moral reasons, but for security reasons, I think super, super important for us. And Australia also recognizes that it's important for this region as well. So let me mention those.
That's how much longer is Croatia the contact? You have a busy. Well, you just got a pretty. You have 6 months. It's a pretty rich agenda and important. Let me open it up. We have microphones. I'll call on you. We have some expertise in the room for sure. In the back there, Beck. And if you wouldn't mind just helping the speaker understand who you are. Or,
sure.
yeah.
My name's Rebecca Weiser. I'm from Quadrant Magazine. Just wanted to ask you something that it looks to me like potentially a vulnerability for NATO, and that is the role of the United States, obviously, is the anchor for NATO, but also we count on the United States as our pillar for our security here in Australia, and I'm sure for many in the region. What has NATO done in thinking about that? I mean, we've seen people like Elbridge Colby writing about how waging the war in NATO obviously depletes the United States' ability to respond in Asia. So just your general comments in relation to that.
So it's a great question, and we do, we're aware in NATO of the concerns here. I'd say a couple of things. First, we are hoping to avoid waging a war in Europe, but I don't say that just glibly. Having strong deterrence is the best in NATO, is a contributor to security here, and we are getting stronger fast. And I think it's extremely clear, to me anyway, that the Russians want nothing to do with a fight with NATO. So I'm actually pretty confident that we can maintain deterrence. Second point is, however, that the US has repeatedly, and over my entire time at NATO, a bit more clearly under President Trump, put the feet to the fire of the other allies, including my own country, and quite rightly, to actually carry more of a burden of their own defense. And Trump used to say that they have to pay up. And it sounds like, gangster talk that they have to pay the US. But actually, he never said you have to pay the US. What he said was you have to pay for yourself. Like, you have to pay your own defense in your own country. And that has, not just him, but it has spurred a gigantic increase in defense spending in NATO countries, and all kinds of equipment's being purchased. So I think we're doing better, much better now, to be able to have Europeans and Canadians take care of a lot of the security, increasing amount of the security burden for ourselves, including to free up the US to do more things that it needs to do with its allies here. And then the final point I would say is, of course, as we just discussed, I think all NATO allies have come a long, long way in recognizing that actually the security of this region and the security of the Euro-Atlantic region are intertwined. So I think there's a lot better understanding to provide support also to the US, not NATO and not militarily, but in other ways. And you've seen Canadian ships and French ships and UK have been all out here in the region trying to, for example, support the US on freedom of navigation. Australia has, of course. So I think you're seeing more burden sharing also out here from NATO allies as opposed to NATO.
Our surveys at the U.S. Study Center, we have a new one coming out in a week, show the American public support for alliances. NATO, Australia, Japan is the highest it's ever been. And that's pretty consistent, that high level over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And it's not just ours, it's the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Gallup. So the public support for NATO is actually quite robust. And the interesting thing is, and this is probably different from Australia, maybe Europe, the younger the Americans answering the question, the more pro-NATO they are. So the most pro-NATO demographic in US polling is people in their 20s. So that's sort of probably the opposite, I guess, of Australia a little bit. But and within Congress too, although there's criticism of NATO, criticism of Canada, defense spending.
But they're right about that.
Yeah. When legislation goes, it always supports NATO. I've debated whether or not, Bridge Colby's a friend of mine, I've debated about whether or not to invite him out because my friends back in Washington are puzzled at how much attention he gets in Australia. It is one view within the Trump camp that we need to get out of Europe to deal with Asia, but it is not, I would say, the majority view. Anyway, we'll have more on that at the center. Yes, sir, over here, and then we'll go to you there.
Thank you very much, James. So I work in informatics. Particularly, I'm very aware of artificial intelligence and all the cyber things. I also appreciate that, James, you had the experience with unaligned movement because Yugoslavia was one of the parts which was ruined by some outside forces, not as disinformation wants to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm thinking like, cui bono, what does Australia have to do with Atlantic sort of union at the time when we have cost of living struggles, young people? So how is going to like close to $500 billion money going to be spent when actually nobody wants to come to Australia? We are isolated when actually the biggest threat is cyber attacks and all those soft actually things. So why is Australia spending so much huge money on something that has no value, particularly in 20, 30 years? It will be outdated, absolutely.
You mean why is Australia spending so much on hardware or on weapon systems?
Or on weapons, like it's ridiculous. And Paul Keating already said that's the most stupid thing ever done by politician. So it was like paying the bill for somebody else's benefits for America. So yeah, that's my question. Like, where's the sanity here?
Well, we'll deal with Paul Keating another time, but it is probably a question that NATO publics ask. Like, if cyber is the threat, if climate is the threat, are we investing in the right capabilities? It's a debate here.
Oh,
it's a debate
absolutely.
in the US too. We're talking about these emerged, whatever past tense of emerging is, threats, talking about cyber, you're talking about climate. Are we, NATO, the US, Australia, and others, are we right to be spending money on kit that is, hardware?
Yeah. So it's a good question.
I think I got that right. Yeah.
I think I would commend you to speak to, for example, Ukrainians or our colleagues in Poland or the Baltic states. They are, I mean, we all feel that way, but I just say they feel it more acutely. You're absolutely right that these threats are emerging and we have to invest in them. And I'll come to that point. But there is no substitute, unfortunately, for having robust, concrete military defenses when you're faced with someone who does have those things, because cyber is not going to defend your bridge when the missile comes or when the tank shows up. And the tank does show up. Yeah, no, I understand that. But in this case, I guess you're talking more Navy and Air Force and missile systems. If you look, for example, at Chinese missile development, it is gigantic. And that's a real thing. That's going to crash down on somebody's head if they use it. So you have to be able to defend against those things. And you have to maintain your freedom of navigation, et cetera, and be able to defend your interests and your values. So I think from our point of view, there's no substitute for that. But I also agree with you, or maybe not agree with you because you may have a slightly different point, but one of the struggles I have is to actually focus allies to spend maybe a little bit of that money on the innovation aspects, or a little bit more on the innovation aspects, like cyber, as you mentioned, because, you know, we had Eric Schmidt, the guy who used to run Google, at NATO headquarters, and he briefed the council, and I did afterwards. But what he said was, you know, you guys are spending X amount on heavy metal. If you spent 10% of that, 5% of that amount, a little bit less on the heavy metal, but invested it in innovative technologies and cyber, you get 50% more effect out of what you're doing than the way in which you're doing it now. So that's his view. I share a little bit of that view. We struggle a little bit because I think of two things. One is we have a lot of muscle memory in the way in which organizations work. And, you know, you have certain ways of identifying requirements and then investing in them and budgeting for them. They're not really made for rapid innovation and for cyber. They're made for F-35s and that sort of thing. So we need to work on adjusting our procedures to be a little bit more modern and acquire some of the capabilities that you're talking about. So I agree with you in that.
You kind of have to do both.
You have
all
to.
three. You have to do cyber, you have to do metal bending, and you have to do innovation.
You
which will affect
do
both.
have to do all of those things, unfortunately. And, you know, in the end, it costs money. But we're in a worse world than we were 10 years ago. Like, the peace dividend is gone. And so now it's time to spend again. That's the way it is.
Gus, help me out here, but I'm sure pretty sure the Defense Strategic Review that was commissioned by this government highlighted the fact that Australia is 98% dependent on sea lanes. So there are material dependencies Australia has to survive as an economy, a society, that can be interrupted by metal. Yeah.
Coercion, I think it's been really clearly articulated by this government. You don't have to be attacked on land to be influenced in a malign way. And I think just to your last comment, I think the issue that we've all got to grapple with is what in the tech terms, people talk about convergence. You know, we talk on our phones, but we're seeing it in technology. We've put a lot of store now to Defense Strategic Review on long-range missiles. Well, to fire a long-range missile, you need surveillance from space. You need to be able to, therefore, you need to be able to communicate with that satellite. So there's a cyber domain element to that. And then that missile probably needs precision navigation and timing from space. So if you break any of those connective tissue, it doesn't matter whether you've got the most sophisticated missile or the most sophisticated target or the most sophisticated piece of metal to launch from. So I think this is, you're quite right about muscle memory. We're probably still, we're getting better, but we're still preparing for the last war and convergence. You know, and fair enough too, by the way. I mean, countries like China legitimately have a right to be as dominant in space as a country like America. That brings a whole different, it makes the world transparent in a way that we haven't had to do over time.
I have a couple hands up. You've been patient right here in the blue suit, and I think you were next.
My name is Mabo. I'm from China's Nanjing University. I'm a professor of international politics there. I was at NAU for China's relation with Indo-Pacific strategy, and my Australian colleague told me that if I want to understand this country's China policy, I should really come to here. Here I am.
Come to this room to hear James.
I mean, when it's this institute. I think this suggests you're making a lot of influence on this country's China policy.
How long are you in Australia?
I'll be leaving on Friday. But my question is that I think the Chinese IR scholars or the strategists probably talking about two things will happen sooner or later. One is that the American will NATOize its allies, like the Quad and the AUKUS and the Five Eyes, and plus Japan and Korea. So they make a Asian NATO. That's sooner or later. Another thing is that the Americans will drag the NATO come to the Asia Pacific sooner or later. Last year, I think they were talking about have a branch in Tokyo, right? In the summit.
Office.
Right. So, but James, it seems that you suggest that NATO will not come to this region militarily, but other options are on the table. Then you also suggest that China is helping and being a de facto ally of Russia to go to the doorstep of NATO. So why NATO can't come to this region militarily if the US asks? And do you think that will be probably the reason is because China is driving a wedge between its NATO leaders, like the the relation with France and Germany, if that's okay for you to comment.
Yeah,
And perhaps Professor Green can comment about the Asians NATO thing.
Sure, you should come by and visit before you go. I'll tell you all our secrets
Okay.
before you go home to Nanda. Yeah.
So obviously I can't comment on the US's intent for its relationships here, though I have never heard anyone in the US talk about creating an Asian NATO. That's something that comes from other parties. But why would NATO not go to this region militarily? I mean, there's the sort of legal reason, which is we have a charter, which is a legally binding document, which quite clearly states that NATO is a Euro-Atlantic body, and it's about Euro-Atlantic defense. And it actually sets out, sorry, not in the charter, but in another document that we have, there are clear parameters of what we have to defend. And, our military commanders, like any military commanders, know exactly what that is. It's not here. So that's okay. Second, there is not just not a consensus, but no interest in NATO allies to deploy the NATO machine here. So it's not that the US decides what everybody does and then we all do it. And I'll give you a good example of that, the Iraq War. A number of NATO allies participated. NATO did not, because there was no consensus to do it. My country did not. And most NATO allies, made their own decisions. But there's this sort of image that NATO is the cat's paw, as we say in English, of the United States, but it really isn't. And they cannot impose their will even on Montenegro. If Montenegro says, NATO doesn't do this, it will not happen. And I can give you a million examples of where smaller countries have just said no, and that's a no. So I wouldn't worry here that somehow NATO is going to be instrumentalized to deploy militarily in this region. It will not.
At the beginning of the Cold War, John Foster Dulles, who negotiated ANZUS and the US-Japan, US-Philippines treaties, he wanted an Asian NATO. He wrote an article in Foreign Affairs calling for a Pacific Pact, but nobody else wanted to do it. And I don't think anybody wants to still. There's a lot of reasons why. But to the extent you've seen small groupings and small NATOs, as the Chinese Foreign Ministry calls it, it would be very hard to imagine any of those things happening, whether it's AUKUS or the Quad in its current form, or the Quad with Australia, Japan, US, Philippines. It'd be hard to imagine any of those happening without Xi Jinping. I think that's been the primary driver. But come by my office, we'll talk before you go back to Nanda. Right, you're right here in the front.
Yes.
What, can you wait for the mic? Yeah.
My name is Cosmos, and this is an interesting citizen. My question is, after World War II, there were other institutions formed along with.
There you go.
After World War II, there were other institutions that were established along with NATO, such as the UN, World Trade Organization, other organizations, to try and ensure that there are diplomatic solutions to world conflict, that we don't always go to a zero-sum solution that involves our military outcomes. But we've seen over the past many decades that these institutions are being attacked by so-called allies to the institutions. So we've seen a deinstitutionalization across the world, the ability of the UN to actually have any influence in global policy. And I'm aware of issues around the Security Council and the veto vote and so on. But I'm just wondering, as one of those institutions, how do you see a non-kinetic solution being, I guess, somewhat resulting? Do we always have to go to a zero-sum game solution where one country wins, one country loses? Why can't we work? Well, yeah, exactly. Look for diplomacy. Where's the role of diplomacy in all this?
So NATO's had a history of this with the Partnership for Peace and other things. What has happened to the reassurance part of the Russia problem for NATO?
So, well, but yeah, I think it's really, it's a fantastic question. And I did 4 years of UN peacekeeping before I came to NATO, so I had a little experience with that. But I think it's important to actually maybe look at it from a different point of view, in that, first of all, NATO and the EU, they're very much, in one sense, sister organizations. And that is, they were created at the end of the Second World War, after not just 50 years, but hundreds of years of European countries tearing each other apart. This was the most war-torn, bloody place in the world, possibly in the history of the world, leaving aside maybe our friends Genghis Khan and Timur. So we see those organizations, both NATO and the EU, as diplomatic, as the result of diplomacy to create peace within that zone. So that's already one area where we see diplomacy actually having paid off. And we built integration, economic and military integration, precisely to prevent war between these countries. So we see this as a diplomatic success. So then we have engaged as NATO, I'll speak for NATO, in diplomacy with, so we have 50 partner countries, countries that are not NATO member states, with which we work to try to build trust, build cooperation. We exercise with them, but we provide support programs. We do scientific exchanges with them and cooperation with them, political dialogue with them around the world. Australia is one of them that's more developed. So we do try as an organization to promote that. And, you know, we went through this period where after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everyone had high hopes. So did we. So, you know, we had, as NATO, great relations with the Russians. We were deployed in the field together in the Balkans. We had programs for fighting narcotics coming out of Afghanistan with them, like training programs all around. We had a structural council with them where we met every month, and all sorts of sub-councils where we worked on all kinds of areas of cooperation. And we liked it. It was great. I was part of that process. And then we saw them start to turn because they got stronger and the old echoes came back of what they wanted to reclaim the lands that they felt had been unjustly taken away from them, rather than newly liberated countries that wanted to get away from the yoke. And that's what NATO enlargement has been, which is countries beating down the door to get in. Rather than us going to get it, we're trying to slow it down, to be honest. So just to say, you know, we really have tried diplomacy, and that failed with the Russians. What has happened is, as we all know this, basically, in the end, these global structures depend on the great powers getting along. And since they don't, these structures don't work that well. And we're sort of defaulting to regional organizations to try to build at least regional dialogue and regional diplomacy. But, you know, we don't see military activity as the solution. On the contrary, we want to be strong to prevent war. And we're quite convinced that in our context, strength is the best way to ensure peace. Weakness invites, in our case, risk-taking by Russia, and we don't intend to allow that.
I think the story is a little bit better with China, a little bit better. The U.S. National Security Advisor was in China last week. People like me who've been in the U.S. government have constant, what are called second track dialogues with former Chinese officials, but they're very frustrating. They're important, but they're very frustrating. Part of it, I think, is that the internationalists at places like IMEMO in Russia or Kicker in China don't have access to Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, the kind of people that the US, Canada, and others rely on to try to get these dialogues going are themselves sort of frozen out. But it's still important, and it goes on, if that's any reassurance. We still have time for, I think we'll get one in the back and then get some in the front.
Nick Cato, I'm a senior fellow at the Menzies Research Centre and a columnist with The Australian. I wanted to ask you about something that's been highlighted by the Ukraine conflict, that's security dependency when it comes to energy. And ask you if there's consideration going on, active consideration about the possible security dependence that's building in the renewable sector and in particularly batteries, and also possibly uranium. So the energy transition is producing a new security dependency risk.
Oh, yeah. So we think a lot about that. And in fact, we have been tasked, as we call it, by our heads of state and government in Washington to design an energy transition for NATO countries, which takes account, including of that. So, you know, when Russia invaded Ukraine and continued to, but expanded its weaponization of energy, NATO countries, EU countries in particular, took the decision to get off Russian oil and gas. And it was not easy to do, but it was easy to design. You could see how to do it. You know, you get more LNG from the United States, you get more from the Middle East, you get more through Azerbaijan, you have to transition your own economies, provide more mutual support through interconnectors and reverse flows. But you could do it, and they did it in very short order. However, the energy transition, we've looked at it very carefully. I have never seen any kind of a prediction of the energy transition where we do not create a new strategic dependency on China. And this is a real challenge. There are, of course, as you know very well, a number of initiatives underway to kind of friendshore or reshore the essential supplies of, in particular, critical minerals, rare earths, but also semiconductors and battery technology. We really need to lean in on this. And I think one of the most obvious examples is how China, you know, sometimes they help us. And by cutting off supply of critical minerals like germanium, for example, recently, to punish a country for doing something it didn't like. It has done that, you know, for salmon, if you met the Dalai Lama, but it also does it on critical minerals and rare earths. Russia's 90+% domination of processing of these rare earths and minerals is of profound concern, and we need to find a way to get off it. But it's hard, and it means governments have to lean in, because commercially, it is not possible for companies to make money in the West on their own without government support. It's just not viable anymore. And China hasn't stopped investing in this. It's still doing it, but it has a 10-year lead, huge resources, and it is willing to, of course, you know, flout all WTO rules, subsidize its own companies. So it's a really hard thing to do. And stockpiling is very complicated because you might make the wrong bet. You know, you can stockpile lithium, but now there's sodium electric batteries. So are we still going to be using lithium in 15 years if you signed a 15-year contract with a mine? Who knows? I don't. I guess just to conclude on that, one of the things we're going to need to do is, as societies, tell the public we're going to have to make some bets, and not all of them are going to work. And it's going to cost money, but it's worth it for our future security, because if it gets cut off, and it can be cut off demonstrably by China, because they do it, we're all in big trouble. So we're going to have to spend some money, more money, and make some bets that don't succeed. And please accept that as being part of the risks we have to take.
You want to ask a question in the front here, Beck?
Hey, great. Thanks for coming down to speak to us. This has been really, really interesting. I'm just curious, I hate to be the one who asks this question, but I felt like it would come up at some point, and I think it's worth exploring. Obviously, we've enjoyed the sort of safety of the transatlantic partnership for many years, and you know, nearly a century, and we have sort of potentially a period of tumult coming up in the context of a possible another Trump administration, and maybe this is too political for you to comment on, but I understand. What do you see as the future for that partnership, and particularly with the context, you know, Poland sort of Fidesz having, you know, sort of a real promotion of NATO, other countries not meeting their 2%, Trump openly denigrating many of the member states as well as a result of that, and even denigrating other international institutions. So I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, good question. And everybody, you know, talks about Trump. I don't want to underplay a Trump presidency, but actually, I'll say very honestly, I think we are relatively calm about that possibility. And that is for a couple of reasons. One is the Trump presidency the last time, where he was much more openly anti-NATO, certainly at the beginning of his term, did not end with any damage to NATO. On the contrary, more money was put into NATO. And actually, more US forces were deployed into Europe under President Trump. For all the talk, he actually deployed forces, more forces to Europe. So that's one thing. Then second, the language is different now. There's a lot of concern about the countries that don't pay 2%, but there isn't a fundamental questioning of NATO. That's different. And we see that not just through public statements, but through other channels. Second is, as you quite rightly pointed out, there's very strong public support for NATO in the United States. There's strong support for NATO, bipartisan support in Congress. There is a law just put into place to make it impossible for the US president to withdraw, and we don't hear him talking about withdrawing. So that's, I think, relatively reassuring. I think if you don't pay 2%, my country, you're going to face a huge amount of pressure. They know who isn't paying, and they intend to put pressure on those countries. That hurts to make them take the steps necessary. So it's not going to be easy for anyone. And of course, sometimes the foreign policy can be a little bit less predictable than maybe under other administrations. So, we have to manage that, but we're confident that we can.
Can we get the gentleman in the front, Janine?
Thanks. I'm just an old codger interested. You paint the other side as if they are nasty Al Capone and so trying to get your. I mean, it is as if you are so honky dory that you have not done anything to challenge their kind of existence. Surely there's the tit for tat. I think you have bombed Yugoslavia. You have done many other things. And also, what makes you so sure that NATO is a cohesive enterprise, given that, see, the Germans has become very right-wing. AFD has come in. You have I wouldn't say fascist or right-wing government in Italy, and France is all neither here nor there. And you have Brexit. Nigel Farage is getting quite active. So what makes you so sure that you have a cohesive NATO?
Yeah, I mean, it's always complicated. I've been in NATO for 25 years, and we've had a whole range of very interesting governments in many NATO countries, and we survived and got stronger. So actually, I'm not too worried about NATO cohesion. In the end, these countries actually know and trust each other. They have very, very integrated militaries. And even countries where you thought, okay, well, maybe they might have a different position, like Italy, when Giorgia Meloni came in, there was a lot of concern about what position she would take on NATO. And the first international visitor she accepted first was the NATO Secretary General. That's never happened in the history of Italy. She wanted to send a very clear message. So we're not too worried about cohesion. And I think on your first point, of course, you can always debate what NATO has done and what any actor has done. I have very clear views on Yugoslavia and what happened there. And I'm happy to defend NATO to the hilt because I was very much part of that experience. But sometimes tit for tat is an easy way to say, oh, everybody's okay. But if you're sitting in a lot of the world in Europe, there is no tit for tat. There is one country that has repeatedly invaded its neighbors and committed brutalities against its neighbors in Europe. And if you want me to start listing them, I can. So we're very clear on who's in the right here. We are not taking anybody else's territory, never have, but we're defending ours against a country that has repeatedly invaded its neighbors. It's very simple for us.
NATO's been through some dramatic times in the past. It's not like everything was hunky-dory and all of a sudden the prospect of Trump means NATO faces an existential crisis. In the debate over NATO in the US Senate in 47, 48, Robert Taft, a prominent Republican, campaigned against joining NATO. And Dean Acheson had to go to little diners in Ohio and Wisconsin. And he realized there are more Czechs and Poles in the US than there are in Europe. So he made his case. And then de Gaulle kicked, the US troops out of France, the fight over INF, intermediate range nuclear forces, in the 80s, with massive, massive protests all over Europe against Reagan and the US. Kosovo was no picnic politically for NATO. So, if you put it in historical perspective, you're not that old. I don't think you were there in 47, 48.
Not quite.
But NATO's been through a lot.
Yeah.
And the compelling logic of democracies standing together for their security and values has weathered it all. And in some ways, the challenge to NATO now is so obvious to the publics, it makes it even easier to weather these challenges, but they are definitely there.
Yeah, very few people question NATO's importance and value anymore. I mean, they used to a little bit more, but
Sorry, we're going to wrap up, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah, but just a final point, which I think is important, and that is, and it's more of a Euro-Atlantic point, so sorry, it's maybe not, but the history of Europe demonstrably in the last century was that the political and military presence of the United States in Europe is essential for European peace and stability. World War I, the Americans came over, helped end it, then they left. Then it started again. World War II, Americans came and they stayed. And they built this political and military infrastructure and an umbrella under which the EU could then develop. So NATO was sort of the wall behind which the EU could create this integration. So I think there's really a shared understanding, and that includes in the neutral countries, that the political and military presence of the United States in Europe is absolutely essential to our collective peace and prosperity. And we need to do what's necessary to ensure that that relationship remains strong. That includes the Europeans doing more, Canadians doing more, but no one doubts that anymore.
Well, thanks very much for joining us. James, you have a busy week. This was terrific. And we benefited from your CV, from your experience, both as a strategist and as a spokesperson for NATO. So let's let James get back to his next meeting, but thank you very much. Terrific.